Welcome to another broadcast from mindyourhealthcast.com. Those of you who have been following some of my broadcasts, I hope that you are coming back and finding them interesting enough to see what I might have to bring up next. As you probably noticed, that along the way we've tackled some of the big problems of today, and those big problems, of course, related to health and medicine and alternative medicine, anything to do with the health field. My intent of these broadcasts originally was to bring material that many people have never thought about, seen, or heard mentioned in the media, and to challenge many of these commonly held positions that's out there today with the various branches of medicine and the various illnesses that people have, the dis-ease that it's referred to, and the modern health sickness system and the cost of it, and just on and on and on. We have been pounding away, not because we want to bore you and not because we're even going to convince you, except if I can convince you of one thing, and that is that you don't take anything for granted, including what I say, but you go and dig it up for yourself. In today's world, with all the books, libraries, internet, and so forth that is available, there is no reason why anyone would have to make an uninformed decision. So when something serious happens to you, whether by accident or otherwise, you want to have the ability to question and maybe interview the doctor that's going to treat you. And to be able to do that intelligently, you need to be an informed consumer. You need to have studied and looked for yourself and reached your own decision. We're not going to try to convince you of anything. I'm going to tell you right off, as we say, the things that I bring up are my opinions. My opinions, I think, are relatively good, but not perfect, nor infallible, nor final. As I have studied over the years and learned a lot about many, many things, as time has gone on, I have modified and in a few cases totally reversed my position on things. But I would say today that's probably less likely to happen, that I would totally reverse it, but I certainly can modify it. And I'm not against reversing it if I find the evidence overwhelming that requires me to do it. I've made other changes in my life when the evidence told me that I couldn't convince myself, let alone someone else, about a position, then I was forced to abandon that position. So as you read through this material that I'm going to be referring you to, and there's going to be lots of it. In fact, there's going to be a lot of interesting things over the next few broadcasts. We, as of this point, are not sure how long it's going to be as far as how many broadcasts. I think the longest I've done is maybe 4, I don't know, maybe 5. But the material to be covered is so extensive and the information so good and so bad that it's going to take a lot of exposure to a lot of ideas, and maybe will be some of those that will provoke you into going and looking for yourself. Now, in many cases, people are not going to do it until they're confronted with the issue of cancer, and as you know, that's the subject. Last time, the first broadcast, we gave you a little bit of definition. It's not very difficult. Overgrowth of cells is pretty easy to understand. That no longer listens to the body. Going into the technicalities, we could go into some very fine detail. I don't want to make it that technical, but on occasion we will be mentioning some things that may stretch your thinking just a little. But if you go out and do some looking on your own, you're going to find out. Now, there's really just mountains of material and books and so forth that we could give you. And I'm not going to give you every one that's out there, but I'm going to give you some that I feel are key ones that are going to at least introduce you to the different ideas. Now, to many people, this is probably going to be brand new in the sense that you probably think, as many people think about medicine, if you have a problem, you go to a doctor, and that doctor will look at you, examine you, maybe do some tests, and give you, quote, a diagnosis, and then will give you some type of treatment, whether it be surgery or whether it be a drug or a combination thereof. Then you believe that that's basically the way it's done because it's all standard. And I'm sure, as I found out from many patients, if they didn't like the answer they got for whatever reason, or they were scared or didn't like the odds, they might go to another doctor and get a different answer which may contradict the one they got before. And then by the time they've gone to the third, fourth, and sometimes fifth, they find out that, wait a minute, medicine isn't so cut and dried. Now, if number one, medicine is as scientific as it says it is, then you would be correct in assuming that they would all do the same test, find the same things, and give you the same answer. However, I get many, many patients who have gone that route and finally found out they're all guessing, and maybe one or maybe none or maybe all in some way, maybe partly right, but it wasn't scientific by any means. And I have to laugh because I don't know how many times I hear that term, well, this is backed by science. But then when you really get to looking into it, you find that the science isn't there. And as we mentioned before in AIDS, everybody has thrown around that HIV was the cause of AIDS, and then all of a sudden it becomes evident when you start digging, as Dr. Carrie Mullis found out. Guess what? There's no study ever showed a causal relationship. But yet it's thrown about as though, oh yes, it's done, it's a finished product, it's cut and dried, that's the way it is. But you find that that isn't the case. Now with cancer, I think you're going to be really surprised because most people today think that it's all cut and dried, it's just looking for the right cure or the right issue that can be applied, and then we'll all live happily ever after. But by the time we're finished, I hope you have a much broader understanding of the problem with cancer. And when I say the problem, not the cancer itself, the problem of understanding cancer and the problem of then coming up with a treatment that could lead to a successful conclusion. And what you'll probably find out along the way is that many different treatments can lead to the same conclusion, and the same treatment may not help everybody who gets it. In fact, it doesn't, as you will find out. I'm hoping that if you are ever facing this yourself, that before you jump and run, that you might want to do some deep consideration. Now, there's a good book, not expensive book and not a difficult book to read, written by an individual who was faced with that decision, and she went through the process, did not do it like they said she was supposed to, meaning the scientific medical community. It wasn't done that way, and when she left all of that, she got not only well, but has remained well for many years. And so she wrote this book called Cancer, Then Healing. 15 decisions to make when you or a loved one are told you have cancer or any life-threatening disease. Her name is Mickey Voisard, V-O-I-S-A-R-D. And I just checked recently, there's no new edition. This is the same one that she put out. And it's a very down-to-earth, non-technical book that is for anybody who has this problem to deal with and what they should do about it. And one of her first comments is, of the 15 decisions, do not commit to any procedure or treatment for at least 24 hours, preferably longer. Give yourself time alone to think or meditate. go away somewhere for a day or overnight. There are many alternatives, even if that alternative is to do nothing for the time being. In other words, what she's saying is you just take a break and then really look into it within yourself and see how you resonate with it. When she says, do not ask how long do I have, your doctor can only give you a scientific generalization. You are a unique individual with a unique immune system. The words cancer and AIDS have a profound and powerful effect on our society. Turn that around. Replace your thinking with words that propel you to action. You will need to call on your personal power often. Learn to use it. Then she says, pay attention to your breathing. Take long, slow, deep breaths. Calm yourself as much as possible. Do not allow this news to overwhelm you. In other words, don't let yourself be shocked and lose all reason and go into the fear and panic mode and start running and say, what do I need to do, what do I need to do, and take off with the first thing that's suggested. And she says, and this is very important, decide within the first 15 minutes if you want to overcome this disease or not. This seems obvious, but it is rarely considered until the shock wears off. You must make this a priority. It is beneficial for the mind to focus immediately on healing, not on, uh-oh, now what? And that's why you don't ask the question, how long do I have? And so it's a very practical, down-to-earth book. And I think that it's worth getting right away and reading, and so that you have yourself prepared if you or someone you know does face this issue. And it's highly likely that a lot of you will. I have printed out some material for the American Cancer Society, and they're saying, as of right at the moment, that 1 out of 3 women will have cancer, and 1 out of every 2 men will have cancer. And that means a lot of people you know are going to be in the shoes of being told you have cancer, and then you have to decide how are you going to handle that. Now, it's interesting because actually I think those are conservative statistics. It's actually probably 1 in 2 with everyone. It used to be a while back, the last few years, 1 in 3, but now I think across the board it's 1 in 2 or even over that, meaning that it's probably maybe 55, moving toward 55% of the people will have cancer and only 45 won't. And if it continues the way it's going to get worse than that. We're going to be moving way down the line toward a lot more. Now, as we get through all this, as I say, you're going to find it challenging, provocative, interesting, confusing, and you name it, it's all going to be there. I'm going to give you lots of, as I say, resources to go to. And first of all, let you know it's not a death sentence, that many people, I've known people that were down to and told they had 1 week left and decided to get away from regular medicine and go some other direction and recover and never die of cancer, live on for years and years and never die of cancer. So that is not a final prediction based on a judge who knows with absolute certainty that this is it and there is no other way and there's no way you can recover. So what we're going to do is we're going to be putting on some rose-colored glasses throughout this whole thing, because when you read sometimes or hear the way it's told to you and then the way it really is, you'll realize that the person who was telling it was wanting you to put on your rose-colored glasses. You're also going to find that many of the things we talk about will be provoking the quack label, because anyone who does anything or says anything or suggests anything contrary to the party line is considered a quack. And I'm going to read you some things along the way I think that you will find interesting. The general principle is that many times somebody comes up with something that works very well. They were then approached by the higher-ups within either the AMA or the medical community to turn over their information And number three, if for whatever reason the person doesn't turn over the information within the next week to 2 weeks, they are then publicly denounced, charged with quackery, charged with unscientific studies, called a charlatan, etc., and pretty much in many cases they're actually arrested and charged with a crime, and all kinds of things happen to them if they don't comply. And there's several people that we're going to mention in this whole process that have gone through that, and some didn't survive. Many were so shocked that in a country such as the United States of America, the land of the free and the home of the brave, the place where freedom of speech is honored and cherished and people are allowed to believe and think what they choose, you're going to find that in some cases that's true, but in some cases it's not true, especially when it comes to the medical establishment, and especially when it comes to a subject of the medical establishment that is probably extremely profitable to the point that there's a great fear if anything might interfere with that. Now, I've mentioned, I think, before, but I'll mention again, that I used to tell patients when I was working on them that probably the average was about $500,000 that a person or their insurance company ended up paying out when they were diagnosed with cancer, and that would be from the time they were diagnosed until the point they were treated to death. They would end up spending $500,000, or they and their insurance company. However, I did see some recent figures who have now indicated that it's now about $1 million for the time from diagnosis until death. And when you have any kind of business that has that level of money riding on each case, I mean, we're talking 10 cases, $10 million, 100 cases, $100 million. So 1,000 cases, we're getting up in $1 billion. So it doesn't take long for that number to jump. So consequently, anything that comes along that smacks of the idea that it could pull people away, just think, every patient that's pulled out of that system is a loss of $1 million, and it doesn't take long to get to $1 billion or several billion. So consequently, they have watchdogs that are watching all the time. And you know, it's not something new. I didn't realize at one point back along the way how far back the whole protection squad is for traditional medicine when it comes to certain areas, and cancer happens to be one of those areas. It seems to me that a group way back, I would say probably in the turn of the century, realized that as the incident of cancer was starting to creep up, that down the line, that this was going to be an extremely profitable area of medicine, and they very early aligned themselves to either take over everything that someone came up with that was good and beneficial and workable, or to destroy that person if they would not relinquish the information. Now, in most cases, I know in one of the cases, the doctor was told them he would give them the information, not sell it, just give it to them, if two things. They would promise, number one, as he did, that they would keep it reasonable, and number two, that they would never turn anyone away, even if they had no money. And at that time, the head of the AMA said, when we have it, we will do with it as we please. And he says, then you won't do with it because I won't give it to you. And he didn't. Within 2 weeks, all of his clinics were closed in this country, and he was out of operation. The FDA charged in and shut them all down. But why, if they wanted it, did they want to destroy him if he didn't give it to them? Of course, they considered it competition and a challenge. So we'll be talking about this doctor down the road, and many others that this happened to. And if that doesn't ruffle your feathers a little, you'll find out that in many cases that the person then, they lied about them, and even when they had evidence to the contrary, they did not let it be known. Okay, so that's kind of an introduction to this whole thing, and we're going to break it up into some sections. We already mentioned about some prevention that could be done in the last broadcast and some of the generalities. In this broadcast, we're going to get into the history and that of some of the ideas over the years that have been put forward as the cause of cancer. And then we're going to talk about some of the modern theories of traditional medicine, and then we're going to talk about some alternative theories, and then we're going to talk about current therapies of traditional medicine and some of the current therapies of alternatives. So how far we get today is depending on how complex that I make the presentation, but I do want you to understand when we talk about some of the different reasons why it's said that cancer occurs, or the causes, if you want to call it that. I think it's important that you realize that it's not as cut and dried as you might think it is, and also some of the alternative concepts also that are not as cut and dried as you might think it is. And so it's not that within the regular medical establishment there's lots of discussion and lots of disagreement, but it's also within the alternative field. And because of the fact that it is such a nebulous thing, that's why it's not that simple to pin down. Now you're going to find a few people I'll talk about who will be saying, oh, well, no big problem. Here, this is what causes all cancers. All you have to do is take care of that and everything will be fine. And then you'll find that some people are going to say, one I know in particular, and I'm not really making fun, but it's just, to me, it's kind of simplistic to say that every disease is caused by the same thing. But to a degree, I suppose you could say it's true, but it's not because you're being attacked by something. That there's certain basic principles of the way the body works, and if that becomes disturbed, can lead to illnesses and so forth. Now, we've mentioned homotoxicology, and whether we'll get to that again in this series of broadcasts, I'm not sure. As I say, there's probably going to be 3 total, but there could be 4, and I doubt if it'll go beyond 4. But at the beginning, we'll just talk a little bit about the history. This is pretty standard. You can get it from the American Cancer Society, the National Cancer Institute, or even a good book on cancer. They're all going to tell you about the same thing. As you look back historically, some of the ideas that have been out there. Now, this is a publication by the American Cancer Society. It's on their website currently. And they talk about, first of all, what is cancer, and then older descriptions of cancer. And then they talk about cancer causes theories throughout history. Now, when you look back for, let's say, the Middle Ages, when people started to become much more interested in people got sick, I think there was a period of time that people weren't that sick. There were some illnesses, but it was very sporadic, and certainly no big epidemics way back. But as time has gone on, these things have happened, that there's become more and more illness. In fact, today, I think that most doctors, as it's appearing to me, believe that if there's something wrong with you, if there's not something wrong with you. I don't know how many people I've known who've gone to doctors, and because they were taking no drugs and said, I don't take any, I don't go to doctors, they said, well, you must be lying, and I can't treat you because you're not giving me accurate information, and I can't prescribe to you if I don't know what you're taking. And I've seen that actually happen in several cases. So now it's assumed that if you're 35, 40, 50, you have to be on some drugs, and by the time you're 60, you've got to be on 5 to 10 drugs, and by the time you're 75 or 80, you must be on 25 drugs. And the modern doctor just expects that. Now, of course, he expects it because that's what they do. But it doesn't mean you need all of that. But then, of course, it's good for business. And when I say business, I'm talking about the pharmaceutical interests. The more they can have the doctor put out there, the better it is for them. They don't mind that you buy drugs from the time you're born until the time you die. And they don't mind if everybody in the world is on 5 to 25 drugs. In fact, they love it. And if they're not getting enough, they're going to go out and in many cases they have, and we've talked about it already, invent something that is a problem and that wasn't a problem, and make it a problem and make you think you've got a problem, that you need to buy something for that problem. So pretty soon, as we've talked before, they're going to have a drug. If you sneeze on Thursday afternoon, there'll be a special drug to take for Thursday afternoon sneezes. And that's how they keep coming out with more and more precise things, supposedly, that keep you coming back and keep you buying more and more. When you have a mammoth industry, such as the pharmaceutical interests, you have to realize that everything they do is going to be aimed at supporting it and to keep it growing. Because people are going to invest in it, and if they're going to invest in it, they're going to want to make money, and if they're going to get money and make money, there has to be an increase in sales and increases in profits. And so they are under the gun. I had an acquaintance, I still do, out in the West, who worked with one of the largest pharmaceuticals, high up in the marketing department. He was a supervisor, and he said that every month he was told, our investors expect an increase, and if you cannot provide that increase, then we'll find someone else who can. And after several years of that, he finally decided to get out of it. And it's interesting that he chose to start a business manufacturing natural medical products such as homeopathic herbs and nutrients. But anyhow, he realized what the game was. That the game was that every month you got to sell more and you got to make more money. And then if you don't, then you're in big trouble, and they're not going to tolerate it. And they can do that. They're big enough and powerful enough they can do that. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the theories throughout history. As I say, way back in the Middle Ages, it ended up that the theory was that, first of all, of what are called the body humors. It was called the humoral theory of body function. So balances of these 4 body fluids, or humors, were important. And they were, of course, blood, phlegm, and yellow bile and black bile. That's what they were named. And so what they felt was there weren't a lot of cases of cancer back then, but when there was, they thought it was an excess or accumulation of black bile that built up, and that's what poisoned the body and led to cancer. Now that concept hung around for many years, probably about 1,300 years. And it was interesting that there is a problem related to humors, but it's not in the way that they portrayed it back then. And that again comes out of homotoxicology, that you're talking about the matrix in the body. And so when a problem is in the matrix, it is not inside the cells, and so it's referred to as being in the humor of the body or the fluid of the body. And at some point, of course, it can penetrate the cells, and then it becomes a cellular problem, which is a deeper, more serious problem. But back then, they had a lot to do with the humors. And, you know, it was interesting, when you study the history of medicine, you see how every time someone came along with a new innovation, that they were considered some kind of a heretic if they went against the party line, and they were usually criticized and many times thrown out. And in a few times, the people ended up either having a nervous breakdown. They just couldn't believe they could be treated like that when the evidence was so powerful of what they were talking about. Instead of considering the evidence, they considered the person to be a troublemaker and got rid of them. And that happened to Ignaz Semmelweis, who was talking about the physicians washing their hands before they came in the hospital wards, in particular the gynecological wards and the childbirth wards. When they came in there, they examined the women without washing their hands, and many times they had been doing something like an autopsy or an anatomical study, a dissection they used to call it, and they're in these morbid tissues of the body and fluid where the body's been dead for a long time, and they didn't wear rubber gloves back then. So they would just come from that directly into the hospital ward, examine the women, and then they couldn't figure out why the women were having all of these inflammatory conditions develop, whereas the midwives over in their section of the hospital weren't having that problem. And of course what happened with them is they washed their hands, not only before they came in, but before they examined each patient. And the doctors were quite offended at that. And they said, now wait a minute, we're physicians. And as physicians, there's no way that we're the cause of illness because we're the ones who treat illness. And they refused to listen to some advice, and they became so demonstrative against him and talked him down and criticized him and made it look like he was some crazy guy, that he literally had a nervous breakdown and was institutionalized because he couldn't understand how anybody could be so closed when it was so evident. And so that happens a lot of times, that if you cross the party line, and it's not a matter of the science, as they like to throw around, but it's a matter of you're creating trouble, you're rippling the waves, you're rocking the boat, and we don't want that, because it would make us look bad if we now were to admit that we were causing the problem. And so that is a part of that rigidity of the system, that if you're a physician, that you're the top of the ladder, and therefore nothing you do could be wrong. It has to be some other reason or some other cause. And I mean, as we could go along, I'll bring up some instances, you'll find it interesting. However, as I say, the general humoral black bile theory lasted for a long time, and then finally, in the early 1700s, it was replaced with something called the lymph theory, which is kind of like it, except instead of having these humors of the different kinds, it was just the lymph of the body that was a problem. And so that it was out of the lymph that the cancer formed and grew. And so that hung around. There were some, like everything that comes along, there's going to be some proponents of it, no matter what it is, that are going to think, yeah, I think that's right. And they're going to go out and become actually an evangelist for it. And I sometimes think that it's kind of like Eric Hoffer, the longshoreman philosopher, said in one of his books called The True Believer, that sometimes people, because of their ego and a lot of problems, have to attach themselves to a cause that's greater than they are, because it gives them a feeling of some kind of sense of worth or purpose and so forth. So if you've never read his book, you might want to look at it. It's generally good for any kind of people who attach themselves to whatever the cause is and become very powerful, almost neurotic evangelists for the cause they attach themselves to. And in many cases, they didn't probably look into it in that much detail, but it sounded good, and they felt that it was something worthwhile that they should be attached to. And so that happens a lot. Anyhow, that happened to the lymph theory for a while. And a while back I also had picked up an interesting book that, there was a long period of time where there was the big discussion whether there was such a thing as cell walls on the cells in the body. And so I have a book written by this one guy who argues very strongly that there's no such thing as cell walls. It just seems that way. And of course now with the high-powered microscopes and all of that, if that isn't a cell wall, it certainly gives a good simulation of one, because when you take those photographs under a very high-powered magnification, it sure has the appearance of a cell wall. But for a long time, before any of that happened, this gentleman was very strongly arguing that the cells did not have cell walls, that everything was kind of like by magnetic attraction or whatever and held together, and that there weren't separate individualized cells in the body as we now see they are when you look at them under high-powered microscopy. But at any rate, the lymph theory kind of faded because some other doctors came along and came up with something called the blastema theory, which is a cancer is made up of cells, was true, but they were some kind of a special cell, and they were referred to as blastema. And they would come up between normal cells suddenly and start to crowd normal cells out and become a problem. Now that was around the early 1800s, and that lasted probably up to 1900. And then we had some people come along and say, well, in fact, Virchow was one who's the man who talked about the cellular concept, period. He said that irritation to tissue causes cancer, and in fact he said it spreads like a liquid through the body, and then later another German surgeon showed that it actually spread by malignant cells moving around. Or at least that was the theory too. So whether that's true or not, I'm not sure. But they thought for a long time that it was irritation that caused this whole thing to take place. And so you had the blastema, and then moving right into the irritation, and then the trauma theory. Well, the cause of cancer is that trauma to the tissue damages the tissue and causes cancer to form. Now, there could be something to that to some degree, because I know in homeopathic medicine that there is a remedy called Bellus perennis, and one of the indications of that is that a lady forms a breast tumor where she received a blow to the breast, whether by a child or an accident or whatever. Then where that injury occurred in the breast, a tumor developed. And so Bellus perennis happens to be a homeopathic remedy that is useful for that. And I thought that that's kind of fascinating because, you know, in some cases, I guess you could say that could be a cause, but certainly not the cause of all cancers. And then later, of course, there was another period of time that some groups felt that it was an infectious issue. In other words, there was something in your body that caused this that could spread to other people's body and cause it too. And so it caused, in some cases, like in the 18th century and so forth, that the people who had cancer were isolated off somewhere else because other people didn't want to catch the cancer. So they called it infectious for quite a while, and of course then that finally changed, and for a while it was kind of up in the air. I guess some of these groups kind of wrestled back and forth as to what is the real cause, and didn't really have an answer, but they considered a lot of different things. Then finally, some early studies began to indicate that in the center of the cell, there's a nucleus, and contained within that nucleus is something that has to do with heredity and so forth. They didn't know what it was, and they didn't know too much about it, but they knew that somehow there was something there that caused it. Well, as time went on, they began to isolate something called deoxyribonucleic acid, or DNA for short, and RNA, which is ribonucleic acid. And the chemistry departments found this in the cells and in the nucleus of the cell. And so they began to think somehow there is like a library of information or some code that tells the body what to do and helps the body to rebuild and do all kinds of things. But, you know, it was still up in the air quite a bit. And now this goes back to before I graduated from high school. Now, in today's world, of course, everybody thinks, well, of course everybody knows about DNA, and they know how it has nucleic acids and how they code for amino acids which build proteins and all of that. So most people think that that's a given today, and they don't realize that it's not that old, because I graduated from high school in 1956, and it was just right around that time, shortly after, that this was publicized, that these two gentlemen by the name of Watson and Crick in England, in fact one was an American, one was a British subject, and they were at Cambridge and they were doing studies, and after the chemistry people had come up with the idea that there were nucleic acids and that it was a product called DNA and RNA, or the two factors were involved. After that all came up, it now became a race to determine, well, if that's true, how does it do that? Or as some people might say, how do it do it? Well, they didn't know. They knew that somehow it came together. Now, it's very interesting at that point because the gentleman who wrote the textbook on the bonding of elements together in the whole concept of the quantum came from over in this country, and everybody I'm sure has heard of him. His name was Linus Pauling. And he actually in his life received 2 Nobel Prizes. And I think he was probably up for more. But anyhow, he had written the textbook that told you how molecules can bind together, because there's certain ways that they can bind together. And he wrote the rules that came out of quantum physics. And so when they knew there was DNA and they knew there was a code of some form in there, they were trying to determine the structure of DNA. Now, you may not realize it, but within the realm of science and medicine, there's people who their whole tenor of what they do is determined on the basis that they anticipated someday they might receive the Nobel Prize. And so many people get into research in medicine, not because they necessarily are that concerned about the health and welfare of people, but they feel that if they can come up with a breakthrough, from that breakthrough, they then can become a candidate to receive the Nobel Prize. And of course, that's the magic carrot on the stick for the field of research and, well, several fields actually, a Nobel Prize. But in the medical field, that's the biggie. The biggie is that you will receive a Nobel Prize because you have come up with a breakthrough. And one of the gentlemen that I mentioned earlier, Dr. Kerry Mullis, who's a PhD researcher, came up with a way to replicate DNA when you only have a very small speck of it. And that's called the polymerase chain reaction. So he developed this insight suddenly how you could do that. So you could go to a crime scene, for example, and take just a teeny little speck of blood. You could take it back to the laboratory, and you could cause it to keep duplicating itself till you had a large amount of it, so you could carry on all kinds of testing. So it became very important in the crime realm, as well as identification and all kinds of things. And so he received the Nobel Prize for that in 1993. In fact, I think he expected it earlier and was disappointed he hadn't received it, because it was a major breakthrough. And so, as I say, in many cases, that's the carrot on the stick, not whether we've developed a new cure or a new treatment for something necessarily, which could be the case, but in a lot of cases, it's because the person is driven for that Nobel Prize. That's the one that you hang on the wall that puts you way out ahead of everyone else. And so consequently, there were a lot of people who were trying to figure this out. And there were people in Great Britain at Cambridge where a lot of the scientific studies and research has been carried on. And these two particular young guys, Watson and Crick, had become very good friends, and they had kind of taken on this project of solving this problem of the structure of the DNA. Well, anyhow, so had Linus Pauling. He was looking at it, and many other well-known researchers around the world were all trying to come up with it. Well, anyhow, in the midst of when Watson and Crick thought they were very close to it, it ended up that all of a sudden somebody came running into their office and said, Linus Pauling has done it. He's published an article of the structure of DNA. And, of course, their hearts sank because they thought, uh-oh, there goes our chance for a Nobel Prize because he has outweighed us, and he came up with the answer first. Well, they immediately got a copy of his article that he published, and of course major articles are published in Science, which is a international magazine where all of the leading edge research gets published. And of course Linus Pauling, being the person who originated the rules for the bonding of these molecules, they figured that's it, he solved it, and we're out of this particular ball game anyhow. Well, anyhow, as they looked at it and started to read it, they realized that he was talking about a triple helix structure, and they had already tried that, and it wouldn't work. And so they actually made models of these nucleic acids that joined together to form the DNA, and they'd made models and they tried it. And in keeping with his rules of chemical bonds of hydrogen, which is what these are called, hydrogen bonds that hold together the two nucleic acids in DNA, they found out that he had violated his own rules in trying to make it work with a triple helix because they'd already tried it. And then they breathed a sigh of relief that he hadn't done it, and actually he embarrassed himself on the international scene because here he had violated his own textbook on how the hydrogen bond can take place. So they continued their search, and suddenly one day it all fell in place like a jigsaw puzzle you've been working on for a long time, and finally you find the few key pieces that help you bring it all together real fast. And they were able to construct a model, and it all fit. It did not violate any rules, and they came up with the double helix of DNA, which now has become a standard around the world. And so I'm saying all this to say that it was this discovery of DNA and how it codes for proteins in the body that told us how the body can rebuild itself and how genetic information is passed on and all kinds of information. So yeah, it really just opened a whole new ball game and opened a big door into a huge arena of all kinds of things that were going to take place. Now then, of course, I'm saying all that to say is that because now medicine feels that one of the ways that cancer starts, if not the way, is a mutation within that genetic coding. And they call them okonogenes, which are genes that have been mutated, and therefore they code for a faulty cell. And the faulty cells develop and keep going, and pretty soon you have a big problem, a tumor. And so they call those genes that they think, because they're mutated, will cause a cell to become malignant. Then they call them okonogenes, and they also know that there's also genes that code for the immune system, and there's a series of them called tumor suppressor genes. And so all this became possible because of the work that Watson and Crick didn't want to come out. Out of what they developed, they made all this possible to open whole new doors of research. And we had mentioned before about the Genome Project, and I may or may not bring it up within this again, that's not so important, except that now it suddenly became the holy grail of medicine was the DNA, because bad problems to DNA causes health problems. That was the hypothesis, and certain types of bad problems can actually create cancer. And then the inverse of that is, well, if disturbances to the DNA can cause cancer, then maybe we can alter the DNA by inserting new genes in, and therefore all we have to do is map all the genes that are in a human and then figure out how we can insert new corrective genes in and correct the problem. And so that became one of the big ideas for research, to be able to do that. And it looked really good. After a while, every time you turned on the news, they were coming on and saying, oh, we found the fat gene. People have this gene, that's why they're fat. And then we found this gene, that's why people are this. And we found this gene, that's why they have that disease. And it started looking like, wow, we've got it all solved. And they started the Genome Project, which, as I say, was a mapping. And it was a very expensive project, took a long time, and they figured that was going to be the answer. And we're not going to go too much into that at the moment, only to say that some other things happened that throw a wrench in the gears. So at this point, then medicine started looking for other things. And so we have some of the modern ideas that have come up by regular medicine as to why we develop cancer. And apart from the econogenes, they don't say in every case it has to be that, but they do say that that can be one of the causes at least, and maybe the total cause, but other things could happen. In other words, something could mutate it from outside. It may not be something just coming from inside. And so now we got into something called viral and chemical carcinogens. Now, you're going to probably along the way run into the idea of a mutation and a carcinogen being used interchangeably, but that's not really true. A mutation means there is an alteration of the code of a gene, but it does not of necessity mean that it's going to cause anything or even a disease. It depends on what gene or a group of genes it would be and the nature of the mutation. So that isn't always the same as something being a carcinogen, which means it does lead to cancer, period. So all mutations don't. In fact, there's a lot of mutations occur, and it's kind of complex in a way, so it's probably beyond what we're going to talk about, but it's actually that within the body, the codes can be changed by a lot of different ways, so that what they originally thought they were all fixed, that what you inherit from your two parents is what you have, nothing more can be done, and now that's not true. They're finding that not only do you not have a gene for this and a gene for that, sometimes it takes a group of genes that are activated by another group of genes who are activated by another gene. So the first gene activated starts a cascade, and they don't know where that's going to go until after the fact. And so they find that it's not that simple. And then, of course, they found that there's a lot of genes that we don't use, which are called introns. In fact, about 90-some%, 97, 98% of the genes, we don't know what they do, and so they're referred to as introns in the genetic code, and the ones that we do know are called operons. And so they don't know what these other genes do, but they also know that even the active genes can change their location and go someplace else in the genetic structure. And they now have found out, without us going into all the details, that you can yourself change the genetic structure, and that environmental things that happen to you, in fact there's a whole big book on it called Deep Nutrition, why your genes need traditional food, because bad foods can actually alter the genetic structure, and stress can do it. There's a whole pile of things that can alter the genetic structure. They used to think the only way a mutation occurred was because it randomly happened in the process of replication of the genetic code. But now they found out, no, that's not really true. Your lifestyle, the things you're exposed to, what you inherit that's not genetic from your parents, but will also have an influence called epigenetics, can trigger certain genes to occur. And your emotional state or states of mind can alter it. So it's not that simple. In fact, there's a good book, if you can find it, by Fred Alan Wolf, who was a physicist, a quantum physicist, and the book is called The Body Quantum. And he shows how a lot of in fact, most of the very, very small things that happen in the body, the very small scale, operate according to quantum principles, and how a thought can change the way genes come together, because the hydrogen bonding is actually a quantum bond, and that we can change that quantum state by our thinking, which means you can think yourself sick and you can think yourself into a defective genetic code, or vice versa. So it's not as cut and dried, it's much more loose. Regular medicine is really hanging on by their nails to keep from letting go and really coming to grips with the whole process of what can be done. Now, I've told you before, they said for years you can't build new brain cells. What you have by the time you're about age 18 or 19 is it. And from then on, they start dying off. They go downhill. Everything you take that's toxic could kill off more of them. They can't be replaced. And so it's like you go up to a peak and then you're going back down the other side, and that's it, and there's nothing to do about it. Well, now, of course, they found that's not true, that you can do all kinds of things. So I'm saying this as kind of a prelude to say, when we get to some of the concepts of why we have cancer and what we can do about it, that you're going to see that the emotional issue is extremely important, and you'll be able to see why that's true. So I've kind of laid some foundation for you as far as what regular medicine has come up with over the years, and I'm not saying it's bad. And the one thing I didn't say yet is about the viruses. They say that I mentioned it, but I didn't go into any detail, that viruses basically are pieces of RNA or DNA, and if they get into a cell, that in some way they could get in and disrupt the code, and that's what they said about AIDS, of course. The HIV virus was able to retroly go into the code and splice into the code and change the code in the cell and create all kind of havoc. Well, of course, it is not true that when you look at the history of retroviruses, you find that none of those retroviruses have ever been shown to cause any illness. In fact, they become an intron, as we mentioned. Those are the pieces of the code that don't seem to do anything, and that's the end of it. And we have lots of them that have tagged on over the years. So viruses don't seem to be a likely reason why. There could only be one that some people have linked it to, and I'm not sure it's actually the virus. It could be Burkitt's lymphoma, which they tie in with a virus. And whether or not that's accurate or not, I'm not sure, because there's been research trying to tie viruses to different cancers, and not very successfully. In fact, one of the AIDS researchers, Dr. Gallo, tried to do that years ago and published some material that got him in trouble because of the fact that it wasn't the case. Anyhow, that's what medicine up to this point talks about, is the carcinogens or like chemicals and so forth that can go in and alter the cell. And there's a lot of articles about it. I had printed one out called "Toxic Chemicals in the Home May Double Your Risk of Breast Cancer," for example. And there's a lot of material that has come out like that, saying that these chemicals can be a big problem, and that's probably true, that they are a big problem, but exactly the mechanism as to how they are is another story. So anyhow, we've kind of given you some basic information about their theories, but we need to get into alternative theories, and there are a lot of them. Sometimes there's several different people simultaneously at different areas in the world came up with the same thing, and these are kind of toughies to deal with. I've known about them for years. I've studied under people who felt that each of these things were true, and at the same time I also know that when you look at it, there's different ways to interpret the data. And that's always the issue. Okay, here's the data. Now, what does that mean? And that means, well, something, but what does it mean? And one person can look at the data and say, well, this really shows this. And then another person looks at it and say, well, no, I can look at the same data, but this could be what it means. And so you could have 2, 3, 4, sometimes different ideas about what a given set of information that was taken from some research, what is it really saying? And what, it might say, but maybe not. And maybe it's none of those. Maybe everybody's wrong. And so we're going to be talking about those from the alternative side, and our next big discussion will be about that. So I've kind of brought you up to date to where medicine is, except for the therapies. And when we get to the therapy broadcast, we'll be talking about any new therapies, if there is any, and what the basis of the different therapies are, and how well they have worked as opposed to some of the others. And I'm sure I'm going to mention some names you've never heard. You may have heard me mention one or two along the way, but we're going to be coming up with some that you've never heard of. And there's a reason why you haven't heard of it, because they were deliberately suppressed and kept away from you knowing about them. And these are some people who came up with some very good information. It seems to me that a lot of the alternative people, the things they came up with, many of them kind of all come together, and if you look at each one separate, it doesn't do what they're saying, but at the same time, if you add other things with it, it might give you a better picture of what's really going on. For example, we've mentioned recently a whole 2 broadcasts on pH, and some people say, well, the whole story is acid pH. And these are people in alternative medicine. Now, regular medicine is aware of pH, but that is not the answer. It is involved, of course, but it's not the answer as they would like to make you believe. And I've heard such simplistic things. Well, if you just monitor the urine and you keep it alkaline, your body will take care of everything. And of course that's not true, not that simple. In fact, I've heard it been said, beware of simple solutions to difficult problems. And I have to say that cancer is a difficult problem. Now, there's one gentleman that we will start our next discussion with, who was he was out of mainstream medicine and research, but yet at the same time, he was a pioneer, and he really delved into things and came up with some interesting information about cancer. And my suspicion is that he's probably highly accurate. And this goes way back to research in the early 1900s. And we'll start out our next broadcast talking about this gentleman and about some recent research. And when I say recent, in 2007, that not only verifies what he said way back, which he made the official declaration of it in the 1960s, he received a Nobel Prize. But if you look back, look at this new stuff and look back at what was going on, I think you'll find that this is at the very least a major player in the problem of cancer as far as the cause is concerned. And anyhow, it also helps to give you some information, this new research, as to why one of the alternative therapies is very useful, or actually more than one, but one in particular I'm thinking about. And also gives us information of something we can do on a prevention level to keep from developing it in the first place. And to me it was fascinating, because it was just a quirk that I came across this research, because when you go on the internet and you start researching, it makes a big difference how you word things. Sometimes you can start out with one word and then follow it by other words, and you won't find what you're looking for, and then you can change the order of the words, and all of a sudden you'll pop up the information that you're really looking for. And that's what happened in this. I happened to looking for some general information about this particular subject, and then I changed the word order, and this research study popped up. And as I say, it verifies some work of a German lady who was treating a lot of cancer and developed a way of doing it. And she proved in court it worked, because they tried to wipe her out, and it went to court, and in court she was able to prove what she was doing was working. So this new research that I found actually is a verification of why that's true. So we're going to be giving you a lot of good practical information in this whole thing, so that give you some ideas of things you can do and where to go and some things to look for, and some that I still have found very little about any place that is extremely important, that I have found from all the clinical work that I have done and from research that's been done over many years but was kind of ignored. So we're coming down to the end of this broadcast, so I'm hoping that I have aroused your interest to follow through and see where all this is going to lead, because what's going to be really important is we're going to be telling you about some things you may have heard a little bit about but thought it was probably not true or it couldn't possibly be, and we're going to be showing you all kinds of sources. Like when we're talking alternative therapies, there's a major book full of the latest. This is the cutting edge. I always listen to the news forecast and they're talking about breaking news. This is the cutting edge. We're going to show you a lot of books that are helpful if you want to get them, but we'll be telling you anyhow, so you'll have an idea about the whole thing. So I hope that we have given you good information, enough to, as I say, get you interested, and we'll be doing at least 2 more broadcasts, I know, and who knows beyond that. We'll wait and see. At any rate, it was nice being with you again. Go to our website, mindyourhealthcast.com. You can find all kinds of goodies there if you go through the pages, things that are helpful for your health, and pretty much all the books that we have talked about, and some other, a page on the DVDs of previous broadcasts, and we also have a link that you can click to go to Alternative Health and Prevention website, which is my office website, and there's some good information there, and some search engine to give you information about a lot of things that you might be interested in related to health. So at any rate, it was nice being with you again, and we look forward to talking with you the next broadcast. Otherwise, be in good health.